Hello, I'm Greg, a sailor, a bagpiper, and sort of a jack of all trades. Continuing on, it is 10 degrees outside this morning. It was -6 last night. So this is a perfect time to be working down here in the shop and not outside on the boat. The last time, focus around, the port tow rails are all stripped down and the stern tow rail is done. Now I have the starboard side to deal with, and then I have all of the handrails and the cockpit coamings. So my task today will be to try to strip these down and get as much done. And then this is the section of the forward section of the tow rail, and we can see this big split and check. Fortunately, the wood is in really good shape. It's not, there's no rot. It just needs to be glued and clamped together. Oh, I take that back. There is a section of wood missing there. Well, we will have to see what we can do about scarfing in a little piece and cleaning that up. Well, that's going to add to the complexity of today's task, but we'll get going on that and see what we can do. So again, the process that I'm using is using a heat gun to try to soften up all of this caulking that's on the underside. And I soften up the caulking, remove that. Then I'm using a cabinet scraper to scrape off the bulk of the old finish. And then once I'm done with that, I'm starting with an 80 grit sandpaper in my palm sander, which is connected to my shop vac to keep the dust down to a minimum. And so I will do the initial sanding. And you can see that's what I've done here. You know, the difference between what hasn't been cleaned up and what has been cleaned up. This looks really pretty good for teak. Come back very nicely. next process will be the refinishing, and talking to a fellow boat builder who I put some pretty good faith in. He's done some beautiful work. His recommendation is taking varnish, mixing it half and half with paint thinner as the first sanding sealer, and then using the Sikkens light teak, which is builds up fairly quickly, similar to a varnish, but they say is a little bit more durable than varnish. So we'll see what that does. I thought of just using teak oil. The downside of teak oil is that it doesn't last very long. You probably have to reapply twice during the season, and then you really need to be aggressive in your cleaning to put more on. And I'm looking for something that's going to be a more durable finish that I can just build up 5 or 6 coats here in the shop and then not have to worry about it again for the rest of the season. So we'll see how that goes. I've ordered all the materials from Jamestown distributors. They're the ones that distribute the Total Boat products. And hopefully that'll be coming in a week or two, and I can be ready to start putting the finish on. Okay, I've got the starboard tow rails all stripped down now. Everything has been cleaned up. Unfortunately, that one piece is quite long for my shop. But here is a section that's split and checked. This back end will pull together fairly nicely with epoxy. It'll clean right up. The forward section. Right here, though, there's a section that's got a piece missing. Now, what I've been looking at is, and the question I have, here's another piece of the tow rail, and we can see where the jib track starts. This piece is from the bow back to midships. This one is midships to the stern quarter, and this one is the last section all the way up to the transom. So the jib track starts here and runs all the way forward, and you can see evidence of the sort of corrosion from the jib track, which I'm not worried about because the jib track is going to hide it again. I believe the jib track comes up to here. So my repair doesn't have to be quite as pretty, it just needs to be strong, because the jib track will completely hide it. At least that's what I'm thinking at this point. I'm going to get my tape measure out, measure that section, measure the jib track, and determine how much jib track runs along here. And I'm pretty sure it does end right at this point, but I'll figure that out right now. Then the next thing is to strip down the cockpit coaming and those handrails. You may have noticed that I'm using a lot of sandpaper. I replace discs regularly. My feeling is that, like any tool, the tool should do the work, and I shouldn't. So when my palm sander is on the wood, I'm not applying a lot of pressure. I'm just letting the sander roll across the surface of the wood and letting the orbital action of the sander, cut away all the material. Now the first pass, and this is with the 80 grit paper, the 80 grit paper is going to clog pretty quick and wear out pretty quick because I'm taking off caulking. I'm taking off the remains of the caulking. I'm taking off the remains of the finish. I mean, all of this stuff is going to clog the sandpaper and is going to wear the sandpaper out relatively quickly. As soon as, I'm running the sander back and forth across the wood, and it really is sort of not taking material off anymore, that paper is gone, time to replace it, and I don't want to have to be pushing down hard on the sander and doing a lot of work. So that's why you see me replacing sandpaper all the time. When we get up to the 120 and the 150 grit, I should be able to go a lot farther, because then I'm just sanding nice clean wood, because the wood is pretty much cleaned up now and all stripped off. So, hopefully we'll go a little bit farther. I did buy a lot of sandpaper, and this is 100 grit, 80 grit, 60 grit, 120, 150. So I go from 60 to 80 to 100 to 120 to 150, And I do have some more 220, 320, 180. So I have plenty of sandpaper to get me through this project. So right now I'm going to pull out my tape measure, do a little calculations, and then I can't decide whether I'm going to start fixing the tow rail now or whether I'm going to keep stripping the rest of the wood. I think I'm going to keep stripping the rest of the wood down because I'm in that mode right now. Well, I did my calculations. The aft piece of tow rail from there all the way forward is 94 inches. The jib track itself is 121 and a half. So 94 from 121 and a half leaves 27 and a half. So from this point to 27 and a half is right here. So a little teeny bit will show, but it is what it is. I don't want to have to scarf in another piece because it really would only be coming up to here, and that would be a really short scarf, and that's probably not the best thing to do right there where this piece of tow rail is bending. The other thing I'm thinking about is that, you know, this is a 1979 boat, so 80 would be 42, 43, so it's about 43 years old. And it's a 32-foot Bristol. So I'm doing a restoration. I figured I'm going to do a 32-foot restoration. That means I want the boat to look beautiful from 32 feet away. If you're going to get really close, there are going to be imperfections. But come on, it's a 42-year-old boat. That's what you'd expect. So if this is, you know, there's a little bit of visible repair beyond the jib track, well, I can live with that. And I'm hoping the next owner can also, because it is a beautiful boat, it's a nice Bristol, and it is 43 years old. So I'm going to get back to it now. So I cleaned up everything inside the joint. There was some dirt and crud in there. Wouldn't have clamped together nicely. So that's all cleaned up now. Got a rag down here, sacrificial drop cloth, to catch any of the epoxy that squeezes out and drips down over the floor. Hate to get dots of epoxy all over the place. So we're good to go. Let's mix up epoxy and clamp it all together. Unfortunately, my can of hardener fell off and snapped off the pump. I have an extra pump somewhere, I just haven't found it yet. So back to the old standby, my triple beam balance. So I have to weigh the cup. You know, these are usually about 5.5. Yep. And the epoxy is 1 to 5. So I mix it by weight also. Let's see if this will just pour out the top. Excellent. Okay, so that was 5.5 grams. So that means we need to put in 25.5. So 10, 20, 25.5. And the scale's just starting to come up. And there we go. And that might not be quite enough epoxy to do what we need to do. I probably want twice that volume, so if I put in another 5.5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then another 25. Fortunately, my shop is fairly cold, and I don't really have to worry as much about pot life. Epoxy is exothermic, which means it gives off heat as it's curing. On a hot day, the epoxy can't give off the heat because the heat is around it, so that it is forced to just cook itself. Also, if you leave it in a pot like this, this is just a small cup, but I mean the pot life is what they refer to as the time you have to work with the epoxy. And when there's a big volume of it next to itself, it feeds on itself. The heat from all the other epoxy just gets into itself, and it just makes it cook that much faster. So you want to spread the epoxy out as quickly as you can. And that will help slow down the process. Trying to jam it in as far up the crack as I possibly can. And get it on both sides. West epoxy is which I'm using, stands for Wood Epoxy Saturation Technique. Not quite sure why they came up with that name, but it seems to make it's appropriate since the epoxy saturates the wood and then also bonds to itself. So you get the wood all saturated with epoxy, and then make sure that it will also adhere to itself. Now, the epoxy itself is pretty darn hard. I hate to get it all over the outside of the wood because it will just make it that much harder to sand everything off. However, I also want to make sure that I get the epoxy everywhere and don't leave any voids because I want this to be nice and strong. Okay, looks like we've got good coverage on that side. Make sure we get good coverage on this side also. Alrighty. Got a couple of drops of epoxy on my workbench. Clean that up before it cures. And some new gloves so that I don't get epoxy all over my clamps. So the toe rail is angled this way, which makes it sort of a little bit of a trick to clamp. My hand screws can be set to any angle I want. Nice, get a good squeeze out at the top. That's good. Well, that wasn't planning ahead on my part. That's better. I always want to make sure you get a nice squeeze out at the top of the glue joint. And at the bottom, but it's harder to see the bottom right now. And it's nice to have lots of clamps. I just can't get all the way over there to all my clamps. I need to have this whole bench pushed farther out. A little late for that right now, though. Little bit of a void at the top here. So I'm just putting some epoxy in. It'll scooch its way down into that little crevasse and fill that all in. I have about 1/8 of an inch of epoxy left in my cup. So I think that happened to be just the perfect amount. I will leave this here, and when I get back, I will be able to see when the epoxy in the cup kicks. Then I know I have been successful in my ratios, and I know that the epoxy cures. But that doesn't necessarily mean the epoxy is fully cured in the joint, because there's a higher volume of epoxy and that'll make itself cure a little bit faster. Okay, so that project is done for now. 25 minutes. I have plenty of time to get down to church. Alrighty. Ooh. Actually, while I have a little bit of epoxy mixed and left over, this is the stern piece of tow rail. That little piece of wood was there. And it will be there again. Perfect. Nice. Always have these funny little things that I need just a teeny bit of epoxy for, and I don't want to mix up a batch of epoxy. So I have to remember, look around the shop, are there any more of these little things while I have just a little bit of epoxy left over? I don't see anything else. So, good to go. We'll be back. So the epoxy in the cup is rock solid and about an eighth, maybe a quarter of an inch thick. So that volume just helped it cure. This epoxy is still just a little bit tacky. And the epoxy on the top here is just a little bit tacky. So that'll take a little bit longer to really kick rock solid because it's 60 degrees down here in the basement, so it's a little bit cooler. Now that I'm home, I just turned the heat up, so it'll be a little bit warmer down here and hopefully it'll kick faster or finish curing. And then I can start working on the handrails. Well, I can start working on the handrails now. And once I get those stripped down and sanded with 80, then I can start sanding everything else and work my way up the grits so that I can start applying finish. Exciting. Well, the epoxy is all cured. And now it's time to put all my clamps away. And none of the clamps got epoxy to the workpiece, so that's a good thing. So you can see the gap here, and everything else looks pretty good. Some, well, where the holes were for the fasteners, you can see the large hole here, that's where a bung went in. There was a bung that had it, and these screws, these holes that don't have bung holes in them, were the ones that hold the jib track on. So I'm probably going to just carve out a large section here and put in a large Dutchman, and then I'll re-drill that for the bung. Probably do the same thing here, clean, you know, because somebody drilled in the wrong place, and you know, just clean this up a little bit. It's not necessary. I'll put in a small Dutchman up here and then flip it over and put another one in from the back side, a little bit deeper to fill in all the material that's missing. But again, the jib track comes all the way up to here. So all of this is hidden by the jib track. I'm just trying to fill it in so that, you know, it won't rot. Well, I think we made pretty good progress today. Not as much as I would have liked, but not too bad. As you can see, all of the cockpit coaming pieces are all stripped down and sanded. All of the toe rails are stripped and sanded to 80 grit paper. I didn't get a chance to repair this piece, but if that's all I've got to do, that's not too bad. And then the next thing is the grab rails, the ones that are from down below and the ones that are up on the cabin top. So that's the last of the teak that needs to be stripped down and sanded. Once those pieces are done, then everything will need to be sanded down to probably 120 and then 150 and then 180, but that should go fairly quickly. There is a lot of it though that needs to be done. And then we can start putting finish on. So, thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button so that you'll get notified when new videos come out, and hit the like button if you've enjoyed what you've watched today. Thank you very much for following SV Slow Air.